Operation Barnabas.
When we consider distinctive military culture, it's also important to understand that each branch has its own rules and regulations. Each branch has its own set of values, and each branch has its own traditions. But all branches, all soldiers, airmen, Marines, seamen, officer or enlisted, pledge their allegiance to defend the Constitution and protect the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Part of that military culture is that it's all about the mission. The mission. The mission is what is important. Just like there are distinctive cultures in the military, there are distinctive cultures within each branch of the military. For example, there's combat arms, there are special forces, there's signal, there's artillery, there's military police and shore patrol, there's a personnel section, there's the submariners, there's a surface warfare, there's fighter and heavy lift units, there are chaplains and religious support personnel. There are CBs, intelligence, combat support, and combat service support. And each of these distinctive cultures have their own acronyms and slang and language and traditions. When we talk about military culture, also a part of that culture is that there are, when we talk about military culture, it's also important to understand that there are active components and reserve components. In the reserve components, we talk about those who are in the reserves, federally controlled, and also those who are in the National Guard, who are controlled by the governor of that state. There's the officer, there's the enlisted side. Again, these are distinctive cultures within the United States military. When we talk about military culture, it's important to realize that we're really talking about a wide variety of veteran generations. Folks who are between the ages of 18 and others who are well into their 90s. For example, World War II was understood to be a success. They were referred to as the greatest generation. There are a few who remain, but not many. They were thanked, they were appreciated, there were parades, but often they were silent sufferers. In many instances, World War II veterans have difficulty in talking about their experiences in combat. And the Korea campaign was considered to be a stalemate. There are a few remain. There were weak thanks given to them. Oftentimes, they feel like it was the forgotten war. In Vietnam, Vietnam was considered to be a loss. There were no thanks given. They were disparaged. Many Vietnam veterans, upon their return, experienced a very hostile climate towards them as a veteran and as a person. They were not appreciated. The Cold War veteran, or the Cold War period, are veterans who were in an environment of being constantly ready, constantly trained. The post-9/11 campaign is long and continues till today. These veterans are often thanked and more appreciated. Let me speak to a couple of distinctive cultures, particularly the Vietnam culture and our current culture. In Vietnam, it was a war that was fought by the sons of World War II vets. It was a very kinetic war. There were many casualties. 58,000 were killed. Many, many more were wounded. It was a draft military, which is a very different culture than our current culture of being an all-volunteer force. There were few women who served. It was an asymmetrical guerrilla war that was fought in a traditional mode. And as I mentioned earlier, Vietnam vets were disparaged for their service. The veteran vets from our current generation, those who served in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, are very different from the culture of Vietnam. These veterans experienced no front lines. There's a high degree of anxious stress, hypervigilance, and there was little respite. It's an all-volunteer force with great use of the reserves. Women are integrated in the total force. There is increased connectivity by internet and phone. There's better medical treatment, fewer casualties, many more survivors. Now let me briefly talk about the effects of military service. The effects of military service are very real for both the soldier and their families, both immediate and extended. And when we consider Operation Barnabas within our congregation and in our community, it's important to realize that we're not only talking about soldiers and their immediate family, we're also talking about the extended family, because they also are affected by the military service of their loved one. There are many sacrifices that are made. There are casualties, there are wounds, there are stresses on all systems, both the individual and on the family. But also, not only are there sacrifices, there's also growth. Every individual and family system are changed. Not only are there sacrifices, but there's also growth. Every individual and family system are changed as a result of that military service. There are wounds, physical, such as traumatic brain injury, the loss of some function. There are psychological wounds when we talk about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. There are suicides, and there are spiritual and moral wounds as well. Recent studies have shown that there are approximately 20 suicides per day committed by veterans in the United States. That is a horrific statistic. What is also alarming is that 69%, nearly 70% of those suicides that were successful are committed by those over the age of 55. What that tells me is that there are a lot of folks within our community who are feeling hopeless and abandoned. And therein lies a tremendous opportunity for care and support. There are also spiritual and moral wounds. In addition to wounds, it's also important to understand that the service member and their families make tremendous sacrifices in order for them to serve our nation. There are social sacrifices. Many relationships change, are altered, or cut off. There are economic sacrifices, especially for veterans in the reserves who are returning to a job. There are other sacrifices we call adjustments to a new normal. Every service member and their family has to adjust to a new normal as a result of their service to our nation. Oftentimes, veterans returning from a deployment experience a whole host of different kinds of issues. There is anxiety, there may be depression, disorientation, grief, loss of friends, or loss of morality, or loss of faith. There may be substance abuse, adjustment problems, relationship issues that include family and domestic violence, and as I mentioned, suicides. It's important for Operation Barnabas members to understand that combat transforms all who participate. The combination of camaraderie, danger, and boredom forges powerful bonds between veterans. Present-day combat, like Iraq and Afghanistan, are different from the past. The pace of operations is very high and intensive. There's no or very little downtime. There's an increase in the number of deployments. Some soldiers have experienced 5, 6, even 8 deployments in the last decade. Constant exposure to fire, hypervigilance, and driving is dangerous.